The next thing then refers to the manner, because we know in the same place you can do different things. We're going to move through those step by step, because especially the distinction between the first two is pretty straightforward. What you can do is you can block off the airstream completely. If you block it, you stop it. Those sounds are called stops. In b and p, you stop the airstream at the lips, and in t and d, you stop it at the alveolar ridge. In g and k, you stop it at the velum. Okay? All of these are stops. Another term for them, because that's only the first part of the articulatory movement, you stop the airstream completely, and then you release it explosively. You shoot out the air. P, t, k. Okay? So they're also called plosives. Plosives or stops. Both terms are correct. It just describes different part of the articulation process. And the labels for those, as you can see, these at least are pretty straightforward. These are already part of the IPA transcription. So this is a symbol that every linguist around the world has agreed on to represent a bilabial plosive, a voiceless one, p. But in this case, it's at least similar to what we usually put in writing. Okay? There, the letter corresponds pretty close to the sound symbol that we've got here, so that is easy to learn. Same with b and d and k. Now, as I already said, you can't just stop off the airstream completely. You can also block it in a way that causes obstruction and friction. Take, for example, the air isn't stopped completely. There's continuous airflow throughout the mouth. But it's stopped in a way that gives you those so-called fricatives, a friction. Again, with the symbol, as we will see, in and that pretty much corresponds to what we would expect from writing. The only difference here is that for those dental sounds, the TH sounds of English, and you've probably seen the symbols before, that we represent the voiceless one in thin, by that Greek symbol for theta, and is the voiced corresponding sound. It's an old runic symbol, F, but that's not important. It's just important that you know this sound represents You've got the stops and you've got the fricatives, okay? I don't think it's a major obstacle to understand what they do. Full closure in the mouth or just obstruction that causes friction. Now, sometimes you can squeeze the two into a single sound, okay? So you started with a stop, you stop the airstream completely, and then you don't release it explosively, but you leave a friction. You combine the two into a single sound. And those so-called affricates, ch and j. So in ch, what you do is you put the tip of the tongue to the alveolar ridge, like t. That's why the symbol t appears in there. But instead of releasing the airstream completely, t, you leave it, leave the tongue slightly up in the post-alveolar position, just like a sh, okay? So you combine the two. Instead of having t, you say ch. So the air is released not explosively, but with friction. And it's one movement, it's one sound. Ch and j. Okay, complete closure, those are stops. Friction, fricatives, a combination of stop and friction, that's an affricate. Nasal, those we've already seen, they're called nasals because the air escapes through the nose, and for that to happen, the velum's got to be lowered if you think back to the anatomy. So and is pretty straightforward. You use both lips, so it's a bilabial nasal. The tongue is again at the alveolar ridge. It's an alveolar nasal. So in and s and t, the tip of the tongue is in the same place. They're all alveolar sounds. The only symbol that that's probably new to you is And the place of articulation is the same as in k and g. It's a velar sound. Okay. Then you get so-called semivowels, y and w. Basically, they're called semivowels because with respect to articulation, there's not major obstruction going on in the mouth. So in y, the air can still move out fairly unimpededly. And in w, it's the same thing. In fact, y and the vowel e are pretty close in terms of production, and w and u with respect to what you do with the tongue. But in their distribution, they're like consonants, so that's why they're called semivowels. Liquids, on the other hand, they're just a group where sounds are always produced voiced, because that's something that the plosives, the fricatives, and the affricates can be voiced or voiceless. But the liquids, like l or r in English, those can be only voiced. There is a major obstruction, which is typical of consonants, and in it's again the alveolar ridge. Okay, despite the fact that you've never heard the word alveolar ridge before, it's come up so often now that you probably can easily remember that. In the tip of the tongue is at the alveolar ridge, but the tongue is so relaxed that the air can still move out unimpededly. So that's why it's also put in a single bin. And another one is the English sound r, or American retroflex and the difference is to flex something, you curl it back. That in British English, the tip of the tongue goes towards the alveolar ridge, but doesn't really touch it. Right. In Southern German accents, you would have richtig. There, the tip of the tongue is at the alveolar ridge. But in English, you don't say, at least not in standard British English, you don't say right. You say right. Scottish English has got right as one possibility. So there, the alveolar ridge plays a role, and different varieties do different things.